What if I told you that one quiet night, a man who had spent his entire life protecting this country, a man who stood in war zones so others didn't have to, was forced to his knees on a lonely roadside, not by enemies overseas, but by the very men sworn to protect him at home? What if I told you that moments before a gun was pressed to his ribs, he had done nothing, absolutely nothing wrong? No broken laws, no speeding, no suspicious behavior, just a black man driving home. And in America, sometimes that alone becomes a crime in the eyes of the wrong officer. Tonight, you will hear a story that will shake you. It will anger you. It will make your chest tighten and your heart ache. Because what happened on that dark North Carolina road wasn't an accident. It was a reflection of a reality millions of Americans already know too well. A reality built on fear. A reality twisted by hate. A reality that thrives in silence until someone is brave enough to expose it. And when this man, humiliated, bleeding, forced to the ground, finally stood up, he made a single phone call. Just one. And within minutes, the officers tormenting him had their entire world turned upside down. Who did he call? What happened next? And how did one moment of abuse reveal a much larger truth about racism in American policing? You're about to find out. Before we dive into this emotional, painful, eye-opening true story, hit subscribe to the Racist Reality channel, because these stories matter. These truths must be told, and together by watching, learning, and refusing to look away, we can help build a stronger, more just America. Now, take a breath, because what you're about to hear will stay with you long after the video ends. The night breaks open. The road felt endless that night, a quiet ribbon stretching through the wooded outskirts of Raleigh, where pine trees stood like tall witnesses, watching the world in silence. Midnight hovered over North Carolina like a heavy blanket. Most houses had gone dark, porches empty, driveways still. Only the low hum of Marcus Walker's SUV moved through the night, steady and calm, like a heartbeat refusing to be disturbed. Marcus was tired, the kind of tired that sank into his bones after a long day at the Pentagon. Briefings, security assessments, long discussions behind closed doors. 48 years of life had taught him endurance, but even endurance had its limits. Tonight, he looked forward to nothing more than breathing in the familiar Carolina air and letting silence wash the noise of Washington out of him. But some silences are deceptive. Some nights pretend to be peaceful, only so they can shatter harder. A soft exhale left Marcus's chest as he loosened his grip on the steering wheel. His right hand tapped gently, out of habit, the rhythmic tick of the turn signal he had used moments earlier. He always signaled, always followed every rule, because experience had taught him something brutal. When you are a black man in America, perfect compliance is not courtesy, it is survival. His headlights washed over the slight bend in the road ahead. Pine needles glistened under the beam. Fog hugged the asphalt like a thin ghost drifting across the highway. Then suddenly, flash, red, blue, red, blue. The darkness exploded. The patrol car's lights sliced through the night behind him, violent in their brightness, rapid in their rhythm. They bounced off the mirrors, the windshield, the trees, painting everything in warning colors. Marcus's stomach tightened. Not again. Not tonight. Not when he had done absolutely nothing wrong. The cruiser's siren wailed once. Sharp, commanding, unmistakable. He felt the familiar sting of frustration rising. That quiet grief that black men learn to swallow before it ever reaches the surface. Another stop. Another challenge. Another test he never asked for. He eased his SUV to the shoulder with calm, deliberate motion. He turned on his hazards. He placed both hands neatly back on the wheel. Every movement is slow, no surprises. Nothing an officer could claim threatened them. The gravel crackled beneath his tires as the vehicle settled into stillness. Behind him, the patrol car door slammed. Then another. Two figures stepped out, silhouetted at first, then illuminated by their own headlights. One stocky, broad-shouldered, moving with a heavy swagger. The other tall, younger, striding forward with the cold confidence of someone who believed the world belonged to him. Officer Brad Thompson and Officer Kyle Rogers. Marcus didn't know their names yet, but he recognized their energy instantly. The type that made assumptions before asking questions. The type that saw melanin as menace. The type that turned routine stops into stories people mourn on the evening news. Thompson shouted first, "Get out of the car! Hands up, now!" The noise ripped through the stillness and punched straight into Marcus's chest. He didn't move. Not yet. He knew better. He projected his voice outward, steady but respectful. "Officer, my hands are visible. I'm going to—" "I said get out!" Thompson's voice cracked like a whip. The rage in it was disproportionate, unnecessary, reckless. Marcus could feel the hostility radiating from them long before either reached the car door. He kept his fingers spread wide on the wheel. His breathing was measured. His pulse was tight, but controlled. Years of training had taught him how to stay alive in hostile situations. But those enemies were foreign soldiers on distant soil, not American officers on a quiet Carolina road. Rogers approached the window, his flashlight slicing through the glass with blinding intensity. "Is this your car?" he demanded. "Yes," Marcus answered. "You sure?" Rogers asked again, with a sneer disguised as a smile. The implication hit hard, familiar, exhausting. Marcus swallowed the anger rising in his throat. He knew where this was going. He had been here before. Every black man had. Thompson jerked his head, gesturing aggressively. "You didn't signal when you changed lanes. Step out of the vehicle." Marcus blinked in disbelief. He had signaled. He always did. But arguing wouldn't matter. Logic wouldn't matter. His innocence wouldn't matter. He unlatched his seatbelt slowly, deliberately, visibly. "I'm stepping out now," he announced, narrating each movement like a hostage negotiator, guiding himself through a dangerous moment. The night air was cold when he opened the door, brushing against his arms like an unwelcome warning. He stepped out carefully, hands still raised. Thompson's gun was already drawn, the black barrel locked onto Marcus's body, steady, unblinking, merciless. And suddenly, the world shrank. The road disappeared. The trees vanished. The forest fell silent. It was just the gun and the man it was pointed at. Marcus inhaled long and slow, forcing calm into a situation that deserved anything but calm. He had been trained to face weapons, but never like this. Never in his own country. Never for nothing. Never because of who he was rather than what he had done. Rogers circled him like a predator assessing prey. "Fancy car," he mocked. "Must be nice using government checks to afford it." Marcus closed his eyes for a moment, not because he was afraid, but because he was tired. Tired of ignorance. Tired of prejudice. Tired of being treated as less than human by men given badges they wore like impenetrable armor. "I said turn around," Thompson barked. Marcus turned, slowly, deliberately. Thompson shoved him between the shoulders. Rogers kicked his feet farther apart. The aggression was unnecessary but intentional. This was domination. This was a performance. This was racism in its most raw, unmasked form. Thompson whispered behind him, loud enough for the world to hear if the world had been watching. "Think you're some kind of big shot, huh? Out here in your shiny car in the middle of the night." Marcus stared at the ground, gravel shimmering under the cruiser lights. He wanted to say so much, but he only said what would keep him alive. "I am complying." Rogers scoffed. "You better." Then without warning, Thompson slammed the butt of his gun into the back of Marcus's head. Pain burst through him like lightning. His knees buckled, his vision blurred. But he did not fall completely. He refused. He steadied himself, breath ragged but controlled, his dignity bruised but not surrendered. He lifted his chin, even as blood warmed the scalp beneath his hair. Thompson growled, "Kneel!" Marcus didn't move. The word hung in the air like poison. "Kneel," Thompson repeated louder. Still, Marcus did not move, because kneeling meant surrender, and he had surrendered enough. Thompson shoved him again. Rogers pushed from the other side. Marcus finally dropped to one knee, not in obedience, not in defeat, but because force had left him little choice. Rogers clapped mockingly. "Look at that. Took him long enough." Marcus stared ahead, eyes fixed on nothing, yet seeing everything. The years of loyalty he'd given to a country that still questioned whether he belonged. The officers laughed, mocked. searched his vehicle without cause, tore papers, slung insults like bullets. All while Marcus knelt on cold asphalt under flashing lights that reduced his humanity to a silhouette. But inside him, something remained unbroken, something steady, something powerful, something that whispered, "This is wrong, this is evil, and this will not end the way they think it will." Because they didn't know who he was, and they didn't know what was about to happen next. Tonight, their cruelty would be exposed, their arrogance shattered, their careers changed forever, and America, watching through the lens of a story, would be reminded of a truth we cannot afford to ignore. The measure of a nation is how it treats the people it believes cannot fight back. The man behind the uniform. The cold asphalt pressed against Marcus's knee, yet his mind drifted far from the brutality unfolding on the side of that lonely North Carolina road. Pain throbbed at the back of his skull, where Thompson's gun had struck him. But even that pain became a secondary echo beneath older wounds. Wounds carved long before tonight. Wounds the world never saw, but which shaped everything about him. Maybe that was the cruelest part of this moment. The officers saw only a black man. They saw a silhouette, a stereotype, a threat. They didn't see the decades behind his steady breath. They didn't see the weight his shoulders had carried. They didn't see the man. They didn't know that the person they were humiliating was Colonel Marcus Walker, decorated Army leader, respected strategist, a man trusted by the Pentagon with decisions heavy enough to alter continents. They didn't know how many soldiers had survived because he trained them. They didn't know how many communities overseas had thanked him. They didn't know how many times he'd risked his life for a country that still struggled to accept him fully. But perhaps the saddest truth was this: even if they had known, it might not have mattered. Marcus blinked slowly as a gust of night air swept across his face. Somewhere in the woods, an owl let out a low, distant sound, as if nature itself sighed at the injustice playing out on its doorstep. His breathing remained steady, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he'd learned long ago that composure is the sharpest weapon a defenseless man can wield. Composure is survival. Survival is resistance. Resistance is dignity. His father had taught him that. In fact, everything he was in this moment, calm, measured, unbroken, was rooted in lessons learned long before the military ever shaped him. He could still see his father sitting on the creaking front porch of their childhood home in Durham. Evening light would fall softly across the wooden steps, and the sweet scent of honeysuckle would drift through the air while cicadas buzzed. Marcus, then only 12, sat beside him with wide, questioning eyes. "Son," his father had said, with a weary tenderness only black fathers in America truly understood, "one day you'll be a man the world respects, but you'll also be a black man, and that means the world may try not to see your worth. When that day comes, don't let anger write your story, let dignity do it." At 12, the words felt heavy but confusing. At 20, they became clearer. At 48, kneeling on the roadside with guns aimed at him, they became prophecy. Marcus had lived through enough stops like this. Enough routine checks that were anything but routine. Enough suspicious glances from people who couldn't fathom a black man driving a nice car, wearing a sharp suit, or walking through a high-security federal building. It didn't matter that he was a colonel, or that he held degrees, or that he served with honor, or that he had sacrificed pieces of his life for the nation. To someone like Thompson or Rogers, none of that made a difference. His skin spoke louder than his resume. His presence offended their expectations. His existence threatened their prejudices. And prejudice, in the hands of those with power, becomes a weapon. Rogers circled him again, like a hawk assessing a weakened animal. "You sure you didn't steal that SUV?" he taunted. Marcus lifted his gaze just enough for their eyes to lock. His stare didn't contain rage, only truth, deep and unflinching. "It is my vehicle," he replied quietly. But Rogers didn't want answers. He wanted reactions. He wanted to poke holes in Marcus's calm until rage spilled out and justified their violence. Thompson spat on the ground beside him. "Man like you driving a $60,000 SUV?" he scoffed. "It must be nice to scam your way into money." Marcus's jaw tightened. Not at the words themselves, but at what the words revealed. The sickness of a mind taught to degrade before it understands. The illness of a system that allows such men to wear badges. His head pulsed with a dull ache, but he did not waver. He lifted his chin slightly, enough to reclaim just an inch of humanity in a moment designed to tear it away. And suddenly memories flooded him again. Moments that explained why this moment was so painful, so familiar, so unbearably exhausting. He remembered how, at 19, after completing basic training, he'd been stopped outside a gas station by two officers who insisted he didn't look like someone in the army. He remembered the time he was ordered out of his own apartment complex because residents only could park in the lot, despite holding the keys to his unit in his hand. He remembered the time only a year ago when a woman clutched her purse and stepped away from him in a grocery line, despite the fact that he was wearing his uniform. Each memory cut like a thin blade, sharp, small, but cumulative. Tonight was not new. Tonight was simply louder. But now, being older, being tired, being beaten on asphalt with a gun to his head, the weight of it felt unbearable. His hands hovered above his head, fingers trembling from fatigue, not fear. His shirt had begun to stain with dust from the fall, and warm blood slowly traveled down the back of his scalp. Yet among the humiliation, among the echoes of his father's warnings, something else emerged. Resolve. Because Marcus had spent his life fighting for fairness, justice, and humanity. He had devoted his years to protecting a country that often failed to protect men like him. But he refused to accept that this moment of degradation, this display of abuse, this perversion of authority, was simply normal. He deserved to drive home safely. He deserved to be respected as a citizen. He deserved to exist without fear. And yet here he was, forced to justify his own humanity under spinning red and blue lights. His mind drifted, unexpectedly, to the soldiers he had mentored over the years. Young men and women from every corner of America, some white, some black, some Latino, some Asian, some native, some wealthy, some poor, some from broken homes, some from privileged ones. He had taught them all the same principle. Power is not a right. It is a responsibility. Use it to protect, not to oppress. How heartbreaking, then, that two men with far more limited authority than he had ever wielded, two men with less responsibility, less training, less maturity, chose to wield their power like a weapon, not a tool. Meanwhile, he, a colonel, knelt at their mercy. Rogers returned to stare down at him, arms crossed. "You people never listen," he muttered. Marcus's heart clenched. "You people." The phrase echoed like a hammer striking glass, a reminder that to these officers he was not an individual. He was not Marcus. He was not a man. He was a category, a label, a threat they believed they were entitled to dominate. Thompson leaned closer, pressing the cold barrel of his gun against Marcus's shoulder. "You gonna start behaving," he snarled, "or are we gonna have a problem?" Marcus looked at him, blood drying at the edge of his hairline, and spoke a single sentence that carried the weight of a lifetime. "I am already behaving." And he was. He had done nothing wrong. He had followed every rule. He had complied with every demand. Yet here he was, kneeling in pain, under threat, stripped of dignity by men who claimed to uphold the law. This was the heartbreak of racial injustice. The rules apply to you, but they do not protect you. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, gathering the last pieces of strength he had left. Not strength to fight, not here, not now, but strength to endure without losing the one thing these officers could not take from him. His sense of self, his worth, his humanity, his truth. Even as darkness pressed in around him, even as humiliation piled heavier onto his shoulders, he remembered something vital, the same truth his father taught, the same truth his years in service reinforced, the same truth America desperately needed to remember. A person's value does not disappear because someone refuses to see it. Injustice does not diminish the dignity of the one suffering it. It diminishes the one inflicting it. Marcus inhaled deeply, his breath steadied. A spark of resilience glowed inside him. He was not done. He was not defeated, and soon, very soon, the entire situation would shift in ways these officers could never imagine. The humiliation would not have the final word. The abuse would not define the night, and the world would learn exactly who they were hurting. But for now, he knelt, still, silent, steadfast, waiting for the moment when truth would rise. The officer's descent. The night grew heavier, as though the forest itself withdrew into silence. Even the wind seemed to pause, its breath held in uneasy anticipation. Marcus remained kneeling on the cold asphalt, the spinning red and blue lights strobing across his skin like violent brushstrokes. Every flash illuminated a truth America still struggled to confront. Authority in the wrong hands becomes cruelty, and cruelty in uniform becomes terror. Officer Brad Thompson towered above him, the thick muscle in his jaw twitching with irritation. He still held the gun, too close, too steady, too eager. Officer Kyle Rogers paced behind the SUV like a man waiting for entertainment, not justice. Every step he took carried a swagger carved from entitlement, not experience. They weren't protecting the community tonight. They weren't enforcing the law. They were performing dominance. And Marcus, despite decades of wisdom, medals, leadership, and restraint, was being treated as nothing more than fuel for their egos. Thompson jabbed the barrel of his gun into Marcus's shoulder, harder this time. "I told you to get on both knees," he snarled. Marcus stayed on one knee, his spine straight. He wasn't resisting, he was refusing to crumble. "I am complying with your command," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm, "but you have not provided a lawful reason for this level of force." Rogers choked out a laugh. "Lawful reason?" he repeated mockingly. "Man, who do you think you're talking to? This ain't the courtroom. This ain't your fancy office. This is real life." Thompson leaned in closer, his breath dripping with tobacco and something sour. "In real life, people like you don't get to argue." That word again. People like you. A dagger disguised as a phrase. Marcus inhaled slowly. His head still throbbed from the blow earlier, the warm trail of blood now cooling against the night air. But it wasn't the physical injury that hit hardest. It was the implication that no accomplishment, no service, no status made him worthy of basic respect. Thompson suddenly grabbed Marcus's shirt collar, yanking him upward. "Stand up," he barked. Marcus rose, slow but steady, refusing to show weakness. Rogers circled him, arms folded, examining him with disdain. "Look at him," he said, "acting like he's some kind of important guy." Thompson scoffed. "Man probably has 3 priors." Marcus turned his head slightly. "I have never been arrested," he said. "Oh, we can fix that," Thompson replied with chilling ease. Marcus felt something twist inside him. Not fear, but sorrow. How many others had heard the same threat? How many never had the chance to defend themselves? How many had their futures reshaped because of lies, because of bias, because of men like these? Rogers stepped forward and shoved Marcus's shoulder. Hard. Marcus stumbled but kept his footing. "Don't touch me," he said quietly. That was all it took. Thompson stormed forward, jamming the gun into Marcus's chest, pushing him back with enough force to bruise. "You don't give orders to the police," Thompson roared. "You don't tell us what to do." Marcus met his gaze. "I am not giving an order. I am asking for basic respect." Rogers laughed so loudly it echoed into the trees. "Respect? From us? For you?" Marcus closed his eyes briefly, not in defeat, but in disbelief. Rogers moved behind him, shoving him between the shoulder blades. "What's the matter? You think you're too good to be treated like this?" "No," Marcus replied. "I think no one should be treated like this." Thompson's face twisted in anger. "You're one of those mouthy types," he growled, "always talking about rights, fairness, equality." He lifted the gun again, pressing it against the side of Marcus's ribs. "You want to feel equal now?" Rogers stepped closer, his voice dripping with venom. "Bet he thinks he's special. Bet he thinks he's different from the rest." "The rest?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Rogers smirked. "You know, the ones always playing victim." Marcus felt the words hit him harder than the shove. He had dedicated his life to serving a nation that often refused to see the humanity of men like him. He spent years proving himself, exceeding expectations, working twice as hard just to stand where others started. Yet here he was, reduced to a stereotype in the eyes of those who had never achieved a fraction of what he had. Thompson tapped the gun barrel against Marcus's ribs again. Once, twice, a deliberate provocation. "Get down," he ordered. Marcus did not move. "I said get down!" Thompson barked again, louder, veins bulging in his neck. Marcus stayed upright. "Why?" he asked quietly, the words steady, deliberate, controlled. That single syllable snapped Thompson's remaining restraint. "Because I said so!" Rogers lunged forward, grabbing Marcus's shoulders, trying to force him down. But Marcus, though nearly 50, was still strong, still solid, still unyielding. He refused to collapse. This enraged Thompson further. He grabbed Marcus by the back of his collar and slammed him downward. Rogers pushed from the other side. Marcus lost his balance, his knee slamming into the pavement with a sharp crack of pain. "There you go," Rogers mocked, clapping slowly. "Finally figured out where you belong." Marcus lifted his head, eyes fierce though his body trembled with pain. Thompson snarled, "You think you're tough? You think you're important? You're nothing out here." Rogers crouched beside Marcus, whispering into his ear, "Welcome to reality." The cruelty in those 4 words forced Marcus's stomach to twist, because this was the reality Black Americans had been forced to navigate for generations, being judged before being known, punished before being proven guilty. Marcus steadied himself, breathing through the ache in his knee. Thompson turned toward the SUV. "Let's see what he's hiding." "No," Marcus said sharply. "You have no warrant." Thompson didn't even look back. He opened the door and began rummaging through the glove compartment, tossing papers, registration, maps, anything he could grab, into the back seat. The sense of violation cut deep, not just because he was innocent, but because this search was not about safety. It was about domination. It was about showing Marcus that his rights meant nothing when they decided they didn't. Rogers tilted his head, smirking. "Still think we're breaking the law?" he mocked. "You are," Marcus said, voice slow but unwavering. Thompson turned, a twisted grin on his face. "Oh yeah? And who are you to tell the police what the law is?" Marcus met his eyes. "I am a federal employee." The words hung in the air like a sudden gust. For the first time all night, Thompson hesitated. Rogers blinked. "A federal what?" he asked. Marcus didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. His calmness alone rattled them. But their pride, bloated and fragile, fought back fast. "We've got a real tough guy here," Rogers muttered, trying to recover his confidence. "Think he's someone important?" Thompson snorted. "Yeah, they all say that." Marcus's breath steadied. He had endured humiliation, violence, racism, and threats. He had been forced to his knees. He had been treated like a criminal. And yet here he was, still composed, still dignified, still unbroken. "Let me make a phone call," Marcus said. Thompson laughed. "A phone call? What, to your lawyer? He ain't helping you tonight." Rogers nodded in arrogant agreement. "Go ahead," he said. "We'll enjoy the show." Marcus reached slowly into his shirt pocket. Thompson tensed, hand tightening around the gun. "Easy," Marcus said softly. "I'm only taking out my phone." The officers exchanged glances, uncertain, irritated, but curious. Marcus dialed a number he had known for years. It rang once. Then a voice answered. Deep, authoritative, recognizable to anyone who served under him. "General Thomas Reeves." Marcus lowered his head slightly, speaking with the respect reserved for only a few people in his life. "General Reeves," he said, "this is Colonel Marcus Walker." Even though he spoke softly, the officers heard the title, Colonel. Their laughter died. On the other end of the line, silence stretched for half a beat. Then a voice filled with concern. "Marcus, what happened?" Marcus's eyes lifted toward Thompson and Rogers, who suddenly, instinctively, took a half-step back. "Sir," Marcus said clearly, "I am currently being detained by 2 local officers without cause. They have used physical force, made derogatory remarks, and are searching my vehicle unlawfully." Rogers's complexion paled. Thompson's hand twitched. General Reeves's voice hardened with a coldness few people ever heard. "Give me names." Marcus didn't speak. Instead, he lifted his phone, snapped a photo of the officers, and sent it. He locked eyes with them as he said quietly, "I just sent their names to the Pentagon." Thompson's face was drained of color. Rogers swallowed hard. They opened their mouths to speak, but before they could, beep, beep, their radios cracked to life. Static. A brief pause. Then a commanding voice. "Unit 47, release the man you are detaining immediately. That is a direct order." Silence. Total. Shattering. The two officers looked at each other as the truth finally landed on them like a falling stone. They had picked the wrong man. And everything, every threat, every insult, every violation was about to explode in their faces. Marcus remained kneeling, but for the first time all night, he was the one in control. A man refuses to break. For a long moment, the world was silent. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful or gentle, but the tense, breathless silence that hangs between two storms. The officers' radios had just delivered an order that struck both men harder than any blow Marcus had endured that night. "Release the man immediately." Neither officer moved, neither spoke. Their arrogance cracked open like thin ice under too much weight. Confusion flickered across their faces. Then fear, raw, unfamiliar fear, crept in behind it. Marcus watched them carefully, still on one knee, still breathing through the pain, still holding on to his dignity like a soldier clutching a lifeline on the battlefield. But internally something shifted. Not victory, not triumph, just a deep, quiet, aching sense of truth. They only care because of who I am, not because they were wrong, not because I deserved humanity, not because they used unlawful force, only because of my title. And that hurt more than the gun, more than the shove, more than the humiliation. If Marcus had been almost anyone else, tonight could have ended differently. It could have ended in handcuffs. It could have ended with fabricated charges. It could have ended with a headline. It could have ended with his mother's tears and his sister's trembling hands. It could have ended in silence beneath a coroner's sheet. If he had been an ordinary black man, just as worthy of life, just as deserving of safety, but without the privilege of rank, would he still be kneeling here, alive? That question dug into him like a blade, because he knew the answer, and that knowledge weighed 1,000 pounds. Thompson finally cleared his throat, trying to regain the confidence that had evaporated seconds earlier. What did you just do?" he asked, his voice brittle. Marcus rose slowly from the asphalt. His knee throbbed, but his posture straightened with quiet resolve. He brushed dust from his shirt, calm, deliberate, controlled. Exactly the opposite of what either officer expected. "I made a phone call," Marcus replied simply. Thompson swallowed hard. Rogers shifted uneasily, the flashlight trembling in his hand. "To who?" Rogers asked, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed that he already knew the answer wasn't someone ordinary. Marcus didn't reply with arrogance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't match their hostility. He simply said, with a clarity that cut the night open, "A man who doesn't tolerate abuse of power." Thompson looked at Rogers, as if searching for some explanation that might undo the last few seconds of their unraveling. But none existed. Marcus's silence was more powerful than any accusation. The night air prickled against Marcus's skin, still damp from blood and sweat. He stood there tall and steady, despite the pain radiating through his ribs and knee. Thompson finally spoke again, voice low. "Look, let's not get ahead of ourselves here," he muttered. "Maybe this is all just a misunderstanding." Marcus stared at him, unblinking. "Is that what you call this?" he asked. Not angry, not shouting, just disappointed. And somehow that disappointment rattled Thompson more than any fury could have. He opened his mouth, closed it again, then forced out a weak attempt at justification. We didn't know who you were." Marcus held his gaze. "That is exactly the problem." Rogers looked down, jaw clenched, the first flicker of shame crossing his features. Marcus stepped closer, not aggressively, but firmly, reclaiming the space that had been stripped from him. "If I had been any other black man tonight," he said, voice steady but thick with meaning, "you would have dragged me to your patrol car. You would have shoved my face into the pavement. You would have written whatever report gave you immunity." Rogers swallowed. Thompson's face twitched. "And odds are," Marcus continued, "no one would have questioned you." His words didn't rise, they didn't shake. They simply carried truth, heavy, irrefutable, damning. "This is not a misunderstanding," Marcus said softly. "This is a pattern." A long quiet hung between them. Thompson finally cracked, his voice defensive and small. We're just doing our job." Marcus tilted his head slightly. "Your job does not include humiliation." A beat. "Your job does not include violence without reason." Another beat. "Your job does not include racism." Rogers flinched. Thompson stiffened. Marcus continued. "I have commanded soldiers on 3 continents. I have overseen operations with millions of dollars at stake. I have been responsible for lives far younger and more fragile than either of you." He stepped forward. "And I have never treated anyone the way you treated me tonight." Thompson's throat bobbed. Marcus's voice lowered, turning almost gentle but piercing in its honesty. "This uniform," he said, gesturing to their badges, "is supposed to stand for protection, not intimidation." Rogers briefly closed his eyes as if the truth burned too brightly. "You wear authority on your chest," Marcus continued, "but authority means nothing if you cannot wear humanity in your heart." The forest remained still. Even the night seemed to listen. Marcus slowly exhaled. "I endured tonight," he said, "because I have endured worse. War teaches you how to steady your breath under pressure, but civilians should never have to fight for their lives on the roadside in their own country." Thompson looked down. Rogers shifted uncomfortably. Marcus lifted his chin, his voice calm but commanding. "You didn't break me, but you could have killed me. And if I didn't have the rank I have, you might have justified it." He let the weight of those words settle over the officers like dust on old wounds. The silence was suffocating. After a moment, Rogers mumbled, We didn't mean for it to..." Marcus cut him off gently. "Intent does not erase impact." Rogers frozen. Marcus went on. "I don't know what you think you were accomplishing tonight. Maybe you were bored. Maybe you were angry. Maybe you believed you wouldn't be held accountable." He stepped forward once more, not threatening, but resolute. "But understand this. Your badges do not make you superior. Your guns do not make you powerful. Your authority does not make you righteous." His voice deepened. "What makes a man worthy of respect is how he treats those with less power than himself." Thompson's eyes fell to the ground. His shoulders sank. Rogers shoved his hands into his pockets, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. Marcus did not take pleasure in their discomfort. He did not want to see them crumble. He wanted to see them understand. He wanted them to feel, even for a moment, the humanity they had stripped from him. Because the true war he was fighting wasn't against these officers. It was against a system that had created them, fed them, protected them, enabled them. And tonight, that system had been pierced, if only for a moment. Marcus inhaled deeply, grounding himself. "You have one responsibility," he said quietly. "One, to protect the people you serve." He gestured at the ground where he had knelt. "But tonight, you became the danger." Neither officer spoke. Both looked shaken, off balance, suddenly aware of the gravity of their actions. Marcus straightened fully now, the ache in his knee stretching sharply but bearably. Despite the pain, despite the humiliation, despite the trauma settling into him like dust, he stood with dignity, because dignity was the one thing they hadn't taken from him. The flashing lights continued to pulse behind them, but their meaning had changed. They no longer symbolized control or authority. They symbolized exposure. Something inside Marcus softened, not with forgiveness, but with clarity. "You may never understand what tonight felt like for me," he said, "but you can choose to learn from it." Thompson swallowed hard, his voice almost pleading. "Look, maybe we just got off on the wrong foot here." Marcus held up a hand. "Stop." Thompson fell silent. "Wrong foot implies equal footing," Marcus said. "Nothing about this was equal." Rogers stared at the ground. Marcus's voice gentled again. I don't want revenge. I don't want vengeance. I don't want you harmed. He paused. What I want is for you to change. Thompson blinked, startled. Rogers raised his eyes slightly. Marcus continued. I want you to see black men as human beings, not threats. I want you to learn to approach a situation with calm, not hostility. I want you to be the kind of officers who make people feel safer, not terrified. He let the officers absorb the words. Because the America I serve, he said softly, is supposed to be one where justice protects the vulnerable, not where it kneels on their necks. A long silence followed, and then, like a shift in the wind, distant sirens rose in the night. Closer, closer. Thompson looked toward the road. Rogers stiffened. Marcus turned slightly, watching with quiet certainty. The Internal Affairs Unit was arriving, and soon, very soon, everything would change. The call that changed everything. The howl of distant sirens still echoed through the pines, rising closer with every passing second. But it was not the sound that made Thompson and Rogers pale. It was the silence right after it. The silence Marcus carried around him like a force, a certainty, a calm that no longer resembled submission, but something far more unsettling to the men who had abused their authority all night. Confidence, control, power. It wasn't loud, it wasn't arrogant, but it was unmistakable. Marcus stood now, not aggressively, not triumphantly, but with the quiet posture of a man who had regained something the officers thought they had stripped from him, his agency. Thompson's eyes twitched from Marcus to Rogers, searching for explanation, guidance, maybe even rescue, none of which came. Marcus slipped his phone back into his pocket with a slow, deliberate motion. The simplicity of the gesture sent another ripple of unease through the officers. Rogers broke the silence first. Who the hell did you call? He asked, voice cracking, despite his attempt to mask it. Marcus did not answer immediately. He took a breath, calming himself, not because he feared them anymore, but because anger, now that the danger had shifted, would be far too easy. And he refused to risk becoming anything like the men who had tormented him tonight. Finally, he spoke. Someone who believes in accountability. Thompson took a step forward, trying to recover the shattered pieces of his earlier dominance. Hey, you don't get to call whoever you want. This is a traffic stop, not... But as he spoke, the radio clipped to his shoulder crackled again. A burst of static. A pause. Then an unmistakable voice, firm, authoritative, unmistakably irritated. Unit 47, respond immediately. Why is the subject still detained? Thompson froze. Rogers' mouth fell open. The voice on the radio didn't sound like dispatch. It didn't sound like a supervisor. It sounded like someone used to commanding more than a squad car, someone with authority that stretched far beyond this wooded road. Thompson slowly pressed the button on his radio. We're handling the situation, sir? A tense silence followed. Then, no, you are not. Release him immediately. That is a direct order. Thompson's face turned red, not with anger this time, but with fear. Rogers looked like someone had just drained the blood from his veins. Marcus watched them with a stillness that held both sorrow and strength. He hadn't wanted to call General Thomas Reeves. He hadn't wanted to pull rank. He hadn't wanted to remind these officers, men who should have respected the law and principle, not hierarchy, that he was not powerless. But tonight, they had forced his hand. The ugly truth burned in Marcus's chest. A civilian would not have survived this moment. That thought alone nearly buckled him. Thompson turned toward Marcus again, but this time his aggression had evaporated, replaced by a fragile, panicked politeness. Sir, look, maybe there's been some kind of misunderstanding. Marcus stared at him steadily. A misunderstanding, he repeated softly, the words tasting bitter on his tongue. Rogers jumped in quickly, nodding too fast like a child trying to convince an adult he wasn't in trouble. We didn't know who you were, he stammered. Marcus let the quiet stretch between them. He knew the script. He knew this moment. He knew these excuses, but understanding them didn't make them hurt any less. You didn't know who I was, Marcus said, so you believed you could treat me however you wanted. Neither officer answered, and Marcus realized painfully that this was not about him. This was about the thousands of others who would never have a general's number memorized, who would never have someone powerful checking if they made it home alive, who would never have a voice on a radio ordering their release. The injustice hit him deep, deeper than the blow to his head, deeper than the knee forced into the gravel. This was the core wound of the night. They had only stopped because he had power. But what about the people who didn't? His voice, when he finally spoke again, came out low but filled with the weight of every bruise the world had left on him. You used force without cause. You humiliated me without reason. You searched my car unlawfully. You threatened my life. Thompson opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus raised a hand and the officer fell silent. You didn't stop because you realized you were wrong, Marcus continued. You stopped because you learned who I am. Rogers swallowed, hard. Marcus stepped forward, not aggressively, but with a dignity that made the officers instinctively step back. And if I were just any other black man tonight, he said, each word heavy with truth, you would still have me on the ground. Or worse. Neither officer argued. Neither officer could argue. Because deep down, beneath their fear, beneath their crumbling confidence, beneath their suddenly fragile authority, they knew he was right. They knew exactly what they would have done. And that knowledge, spoken aloud, brought into the light, landed like a stone dropped into deep water, rippling outward until even the night felt changed. The sound of tires crunching gravel snapped all three men to attention. Headlights swept across the road, cutting a bright arc through the dark pines. A second vehicle pulled up behind the patrol car, then a third. These weren't ordinary patrol cars. Marcus recognized the markings instantly. Internal affairs. Rogers looked like he might faint. Thompson's hands shook at his sides. Marcus remained calm, not because he felt triumphant, but because he knew this wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It wasn't vindication. It was accountability, finally, painfully, reluctantly happening. The doors opened. Two internal affairs officers stepped out, followed by a third man with iron gray hair, steady eyes, and a badge that held authority heavier than the ones pinned to Thompson and Rogers' uniforms. Chief Daniel Monroe. His presence changed the air. He wasn't angry, not visibly. He wasn't shouting. He wasn't posturing. But the tension rolling off him felt like the moments before a thunderstorm cracks open the sky. Thompson and Rogers straightened reflexively, but their faces couldn't hide their panic. Chief Monroe approached slowly, his gaze sweeping the scene. His eyes landed first on Marcus, the blood at the back of his head, the dirt on his clothes, the stiffness in his posture. Then his eyes moved to Thompson's still-drawn gun. Then to the open SUV door, papers scattered across the seats. Then to the gravel where Marcus had knelt moments earlier. The chief's jaw tightened. "Officers," he said quietly, "do you know what you've done tonight?" Thompson tried to speak. "Sir, we didn't know." Monroe held up one hand. "No," he said. "No excuses." Rogers tried next. "We thought he was acting suspicious." Monroe cut him off sharply. "Suspicious?" he repeated, voice growing colder. "What exactly was suspicious? Driving home? Following the law? Being black in an SUV?" Neither officer answered. The chief turned to the internal affairs officer beside him. "Play it." The IA officer pressed a button on a small device clipped to his vest. Then into the night air, the body cam audio rang out. "Get out of the car. I don't need a reason to arrest someone like you. If you open your mouth again, this bullet will be the last thing you see." Thompson's face collapsed in horror. Rogers pressed his fist against his mouth as the words they had spoken, words fueled by bias, arrogance, and unchecked power, echoed through the forest like confessions carved into stone. Chief Monroe didn't yell. He didn't need to. Silence became its own punishment. When the recording ended, he turned back to his officers. "Are you out of your mind?" he asked, voice low and dangerous. "You pointed a gun at an innocent citizen. You assaulted him. You searched his car illegally. You used racist, threatening language, and you lied about probable cause. Thompson's eyes glistened. Rogers looked ready to collapse. We're sorry, Thompson whispered. Monroe's expression hardened. Sorry is what you say when you step on someone's foot, not when you violate the Constitution. He turned to Marcus. Colonel Walker, he said, his tone shifting to something respectful, though tinged with shame. On behalf of this department, I offer my deepest apology. Marcus nodded slightly, but his eyes held no satisfaction. Chief, he said, this isn't just about me. Monroe inhaled slowly. No, he replied, it isn't. The chief turned back to both officers. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending further investigation. Thompson's hands shook violently. Rogers swayed on his feet. But sir, Thompson began. There is nothing you can say, Monroe interrupted. Nothing. The officers' shoulders slumped. Their power evaporated. Their authority unraveled. Their arrogance, once towering, had reduced them now to trembling silhouettes under the lights. And Marcus, finally standing as himself again, watched not with triumph, but with the quiet ache of someone who had been forced to reveal a truth America keeps trying to forget. Some people only respect black lives when they fear the consequences of ignoring them. Chief Monroe looked at Marcus again. This will not be buried, he promised. Marcus appreciated the words, but knew promises were fragile things. Only action mattered. Only accountability mattered. Only change mattered. Still, for the first time that night, hope flickered gently in the air. Something was shifting. Not enough to heal history. Not enough to erase trauma. Not enough to transform a broken system overnight, but enough to remind anyone watching that injustice exposed is the first step toward justice served. And tonight, on this lonely North Carolina road, under bruised skies and unforgiving lights, injustice had finally been dragged into the open, gasping, trembling, undeniable. And the night, once silent, oppressive, and cruel, now felt like it was waiting for something new, something better, something earned, something true. The reveal of truth. The world seemed to pause again. The internal affairs officers stood like stone pillars, their clipboards ready, their presence heavy with authority. Chief Monroe paced slowly, absorbing every detail of the scene. Thompson and Rogers appeared gutted, as if the earth had tilted beneath them, and they hadn't yet learned how to stand on this new, unforgiving terrain. Marcus stood quietly, shoulders squared despite the pain running through his back and knee. His shirt was stained with dust. A thin trail of dried blood still clung to his scalp. Yet he looked composed, dignified, like a man who had walked through a storm and emerged with the truth still intact. It was Thompson who finally broke the silence. His voice trembled, cracked around the edges. Sir, we didn't mean... Colonel, I mean... The word sounded foreign in his mouth, like language he had never practiced, because he had never needed it when speaking to a black man before. Marcus kept his eyes steady. You didn't ask who I was, he said calmly. You didn't care who I was. Rogers swallowed hard, unable to lift his gaze. His earlier swagger had vanished. In its place sat something smaller, something fragile. Regret or perhaps fear disguised as remorse. Chief Monroe stepped forward, addressing both officers with the quiet intensity of a man who'd held too many shattered truths in his hands. There is no version of tonight, he said, that makes what you did acceptable. Rogers opened his mouth to speak, but Monroe silenced him with a look sharp enough to cut. You assaulted him, the chief continued. You threatened him. You mocked him. You used racism like a weapon, and you did it believing no one would hold you accountable. Thompson's chest rose and fell rapidly, his breathing shallow. Panic flickered across his face like a flame desperate for oxygen. Then he said, voice breaking, We didn't know he was a colonel. Marcus felt something twist inside him at those words. A slow, deep turning, like emotional tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface. He stepped forward. Not to intimidate, not to retaliate, but because truth demanded proximity. He stopped just feet away from Thompson, close enough to see the sweat beading across the officer's forehead, the tremor in his jaw, the cracks forming in the shell of arrogance he had worn all night. Then Marcus spoke, not loudly, not harshly, but with a depth that carried decades of lived experience. So if I wasn't a colonel, what would have happened to me tonight? Thompson's lips trembled. Roger's shoulders slumped. Neither answered. So Marcus repeated slower. If I had been a regular black man, driving home, minding my business, what would you have done? Still no answer. The silence became an indictment, a confession, a mirror held up to their own prejudice. Chief Monroe turned to the officers. Well, he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew they had no defense. Thompson tried to speak, but the words fell apart in his throat. Rogers pressed a hand to his forehead, voice small and breaking. We were just trying to do our job. Marcus shook his head softly. Your job is to uphold the law, he said. Not break it, not twist it, not weaponize it against people who look like me. He let the words hang, their weight undeniable. Roger's voice fell to a whisper. We didn't think it would go this far. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, just long enough to gather the ache that rose in him, heavy and unrelenting. It always goes this far, he said quietly. Maybe not for you, but for us. The forest seemed to sigh again, its breath rustling through the leaves like a lament. Marcus looked between both officers. No anger in his eyes now, only exhaustion, the deep kind that lives inside a person who has spent a lifetime proving his humanity to people who refuse to see it. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a small dark blue card. Chief Monroe recognized it instantly. A Pentagon identification card, gold trim, embedded security emblem, rank designation. Marcus extended it toward Thompson and Rogers. Read it, he said. Thompson hesitated before accepting the card. His hands trembled as he brought it closer to his face. Captain, Major, Lieutenant. He had likely seen these ranks before, but this one? Colonel, United States Army, Marcus A. Walker. His breath caught in his throat. Rogers leaned forward to look. His skin turned pale, almost gray. His knees wobbled. Marcus retrieved the card from their hands and slipped it back into his pocket. This is who I am, he said, but who I am does not make your actions wrong. What makes them wrong is what you assumed I was. Thompson covered his face with one hand, as if ashamed to look at the world. Rogers lowered himself onto the edge of the patrol car bumper, staring into the dirt. Marcus softened his voice, not to comfort, but to make his point unmistakable. I didn't tell you my rank earlier because it shouldn't matter. Your duty is to treat every person with dignity, whether they are a colonel or a cashier, whether they are a soldier or a student, whether they are wealthy or struggling, whether they are black or white. Monroe nodded solemnly. And tonight, Marcus continued, you treated me with less respect than the men I commanded in active war zones. The words struck the officers like blows, not meant to wound, but impossible to escape. Rogers whispered, voice trembling, We're sorry. Marcus's eyes glistened, not with victory, but with grief. Sorry won't undo what happened, he said. Not for me, and not for the countless others who have suffered similar abuse. He paused, letting the truth breathe. But understanding why it was wrong, that's where change begins. Chief Monroe cleared his throat. Colonel Walker, he said, your complaint will be taken with the utmost seriousness. Internal Affairs has already been notified, and the district attorney will be informed. You have my word that this will not be swept aside. Marcus nodded. That's what accountability looks like, he replied quietly. The chief turned to Thompson and Rogers. You two are suspended, he declared, effective immediately. Badges and firearms. Rogers removed his badge with shaking hands, placing it in Monroe's palm. Thompson hesitated, eyes red, then surrendered his as well. Their weapons followed. The emotional shift was seismic. Earlier tonight, these men held Marcus at gunpoint. Now they stood disarmed, physically, morally, institutionally. Marcus did not smile. He did not revel. He did not celebrate. Because this wasn't a moment of triumph. It was a moment of truth, a reminder that justice often arrives late, limping and breathless, but its presence can still reshape the night. Monroe turned back to Marcus again. Is there anything else you want to say before we conclude this portion of the investigation? Marcus looked at the officers one last time. Yes, he said softly. He stepped closer, not threatening but resolute. Remember this moment, he told them. Remember not because you were caught, but because tonight you nearly destroyed a man's life for no reason. Thompson looked away, tears forming at the edges of his eyes. Marcus's voice grew even softer. And remember that if you had approached tonight with humanity instead of hostility, none of this would have happened. He paused. It's not too late to change, but change begins when you accept the truth about who you were in this moment. The officers swallowed hard. Then Marcus delivered the lesson that would linger with them long after their badges were gone. Power doesn't reveal character, it tests it, and tonight your character failed you. But failure is not final unless you refuse to learn from it, the chief whispered almost reverently. Spoken like a true leader. Marcus didn't respond with pride. He responded with honesty. I'm speaking like a man who refuses to let injustice define him. And the night, wounded but shifting, carried those words with it, because the truth had finally been spoken aloud, because silence had finally been broken, because the darkness had finally been forced to face the light. Justice arrives. The flashing lights painted the forest in unnatural colors, red flickering over branches, blue sweeping through the trees like an echo searching for answers. The internal affairs vehicle sat behind the patrol car like silent judges, engines humming, headlights glowing. For the first time that night, Marcus wasn't the one being confronted. Now it was the officers. And justice, slow, imperfect, overdue, was finally walking toward them. Each detail was a quiet witness. Another IA officer retrieved audio data from the patrol car's internal recorder. A third pulled footage from the body cams. Footage Thompson and Rogers had hoped would justify their aggression, but which instead showed a narrative they could no longer deny. Monroe crossed his arms, his gaze probing. Officers, he said, I need your statements now. Thompson stood rigid, chest heaving, sweat glistening under the harsh glare of the lights. Rogers wiped his hands repeatedly on his uniform pants, his nerves clearly unraveling. Sir, it all happened so fast, Thompson began. Monroe's raised hand cut him off immediately. I don't want excuses, he said coldly. I want the truth. Rogers tried first. We stopped him because he didn't signal. Marcus's eyebrows knit slightly, not with surprise, but with the exhaustion of hearing another lie added to the pile. Internal Affairs Officer Grant stepped forward. We reviewed the dash cam, he said. The vehicle signaled properly. Rogers' mouth opened, then closed again. Thompson tried to recover. He wasn't cooperating, Grant interrupted again. Colonel Walker complied with every verbal command until unlawful force was used. Silence. Heavy, damning silence. Monroe's gaze sharpened. Unlawful force. That's what I was afraid of. Thompson's face fell. Rogers' throat bobbed as he swallowed. The IA team continued. Officer Grant scrolled through audio transcripts, his voice becoming more disgusted with each line. You told him, and I quote, I don't need a reason to arrest someone like you. And this bullet will be the last thing you see. And maybe you people should learn to listen. Rogers looked down, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Thompson took a step back, stumbling slightly. It was all caught on camera. Every word, every threat, every slur disguised as authority. And now the truth stood naked. Marcus watched silently. His heartbeat steadied, not because the pain had gone away, but because the truth had finally found air. Monroe pinched the bridge of his nose as if holding back anger or disappointment too deep to express. I've served 30 years, he said softly, and I have never heard anything like this from officers under my command. He turned to Marcus. Colonel Walker, you should never have experienced this. Marcus nodded slightly. He didn't feel triumphant. He didn't feel vindicated. He felt tired. This is not new, he said quietly. Not for people who look like me. Monroe's expression darkened with understanding, and something more, guilt, because he knew this wasn't one officer's mistake or two officers' cruelty. This was a symptom of a deeper rot. The IA team finished gathering evidence. After a brief consultation, Monroe called both officers to stand before him. "Place your hands in front of you," he instructed. Thompson hesitated. "Sir, what?" "Do it," Monroe said. Rogers obeyed immediately, hands trembling. When their wrists met, Monroe slipped off their body cams and radios, placing them into IA's evidence bag. The gesture was symbolic, powerful. It stripped them of tools they had misused, authority they had abused, and power they had wielded recklessly. "Effective immediately," Monroe said. "You are suspended without pay pending an internal and federal investigation." Thompson's eyes widened. Sir, you can't. I've got 20 years. I don't care if you had 30, Monroe snapped. Your actions disgrace this badge." Rogers looked sick, like the weight of the night was finally suffocating him. Colonel Walker," he stammered, "I swear I didn't mean—" Marcus raised a hand gently, not in anger but in finality. "You meant every word," he said quietly. "That's why it flows so easily." Rogers' mouth snapped shut. Marcus continued, his voice steady but edged with grief. "Intent is irrelevant. Harm is harm. And tonight, you crossed lines that should never be crossed." Thompson opened his mouth again, but Monroe silenced him. "You didn't just violate protocol," Monroe said. "You violated humanity." The words cut deeper than any punishment. For a brief moment, Thompson's bravado collapsed entirely, revealing a man who had never thought his behavior would catch up to him. A man raised by a system that emboldened him, protected him, disguised his cruelty as authority. A man now facing the consequences of reality, not the immunity he once believed in. The internal affairs team finished packing their equipment, but just as Monroe prepared to escort Thompson and Rogers back to the station, headlights appeared at the far end of the road. Another car approached, sleek and government-issued. It glided to a stop beside the IA vehicle. The door opened. Marcus's breath caught, not from fear this time, but from recognition. General Thomas Reeves stepped out. The general, though older, with lines carved from responsibility and years of war, moved with the unmistakable authority of a man who had led thousands. His presence alone shifted the energy of the entire scene. The officers stiffened reflexively. Monroe straightened. Even the IA team fell silent. Reeves approached Marcus first, his stern eyes softening with concern. "Marcus," he said, voice low, "are you all right?" Marcus nodded. "I will be." Reeves's gaze flicked to the blood at Marcus's hairline, and his jaw tightened. He turned to the chief. "Chief Monroe, I trust you are taking this matter with the gravity it demands." "Yes, sir," Monroe replied immediately. "Both officers have been suspended. Internal affairs is fully engaged." "Good," Reeves said sharply, "because what happened tonight is not just misconduct. It is a stain on every principle this nation claims to stand for." Thompson flinched. Rogers looked away. Reeves stepped toward the two officers, his gaze colder than the night air. "You assaulted a decorated colonel," he said. "But understand, this is not about his rank. This is about the man you decided was worthless enough to abuse." Rogers' lips trembled. Thompson blinked rapidly, fighting emotion. Reeves took another step, his voice slicing through the silence. "If Colonel Walker had died tonight, the only truth anyone would have known is the one you chose to write." He paused, letting that reality sink in. "You nearly destroyed a life," Reeves said, "for nothing. Nothing." The weight of those words crushed the last remnants of the officer's pride. Reeves turned back to Marcus. "You shouldn't have had to call me," he said. "No citizen should need a general to survive a traffic stop." Marcus's breath caught, because that was the truth he had been carrying all night. "It shouldn't require rank," Marcus whispered, "to stay alive." Reeves placed a steady hand on Marcus's shoulder, a gesture of respect, brotherhood, and shared understanding of service. Then he faced Monroe. "This department will undergo a full federal review," he said, "starting tomorrow." Monroe nodded stiffly. "Yes, sir." "And," Reeves added, "I expect transparency, reform, and accountability. Nothing less." "Yes, sir," Monroe repeated. The IA officers exchanged glances. They understood the magnitude of what was unfolding. This wasn't just a disciplinary case. This was the beginning of something larger, something that would ripple through the entire community. Word of the incident spread faster than anyone expected. One by one, people stepped forward. A black teacher humiliated during a traffic stop. A teenager wrongfully detained walking home from practice. A father forced face first onto concrete in front of his children. A woman pulled over for a faulty taillight that wasn't broken at all. The community poured out its pain, the pain Marcus had carried, the pain countless others had buried. And for the first time, the department couldn't ignore it. Federal investigators arrived. Body cams were audited. Complaints were reopened. Patterns emerged. Names repeated. Officers were questioned. Officers were removed. Thompson and Rogers became the center of a storm they had created. Public pressure built. National attention grew. And suddenly, the truth could no longer be contained. Chief Monroe held a press conference, visibly shaken by the scope of what had come to light. "We failed," he said. "We failed our community, and we will not hide from that failure." His voice cracked. "We must do better. We will do better." Behind him, cameras clicked like the ticking of a clock, a countdown to change. Marcus watched it all from a distance, not seeking attention, not seeking glory, not wanting to become the face of a movement he had never intended to lead. But he understood something now, something heavy yet hopeful. What happened to him wasn't just his story. It was a window into a deeper truth, a truth America needed to face, a truth too many had lived, too many had died from, too many had fought silently for generations to expose. And because he survived, because he had power the officers did not expect, because he had a voice that could not be ignored, the truth had finally been forced into the light. Not for him alone, but for everyone who had endured nights like his. Injustice had been exposed, a system had been shaken, and the first cracks of reform had begun to appear. But Marcus knew, this wasn't the end. This was only the beginning. Write an intro with a very strong hook, digging deep into the pain so that the audience feels their emotions surge, opening up curiosity and making them want to watch the entire video immediately, with a call to subscribe to the Racist Reality channel and continue watching. A wounded land begins to heal. The days that followed were a whirlwind, swift, loud, heavy. It was as though the quiet North Carolina highway, where everything happened, had cracked open. Something buried deep beneath the surface of the town, and all the pain that had festered there for years finally spilled into the open. But for Marcus Walker, the days after the incident were strangely quiet. He did not attend the protests. He did not stand behind podiums. He did not permit news stations to put microphones in his face or reduce him to a headline. He needed stillness. He needed reflection. He needed space to breathe again. Because the truth was this: he had survived something thousands of others had not. And surviving did not feel like triumph. It felt like responsibility. On the third day after the incident, Marcus drove again, slowly, thoughtfully, back toward the same stretch of road where everything had unfolded. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden glow across the tops of the pine trees. The sky had softened from blue to amber, the kind of light that makes the world feel like it's trying to heal itself. He slowed as he approached the shoulder. There was nothing remarkable there now. No flashing lights, no officers, no chaos. Just a quiet strip of road. But to Marcus, it felt sacred. He pulled over and cut the engine. For a moment, he simply sat in the stillness, his fingers resting gently on the steering wheel. He replayed the night in his mind, the strobing lights, the blows to his body, the humiliation, the fear he had buried just beneath discipline, the sound of a gun cocking inches from his ribs. And then he replayed the moment the radio cracked open with salvation, the moment everything shifted, the moment truth surged to the surface. So much had changed, and yet so much had not. He stepped out of the SUV and inhaled deeply. The air smelled faintly of pine sap, warm asphalt, and the final breath of summer. The quiet hum of cicadas rose softly in the distance, nature reclaiming what fear had taken from him days earlier. He stood there for a long time, not as a colonel, not as a soldier, not as a survivor of a wrongful arrest, but simply as a man confronting the invisible wound that had followed him home. The investigation moved quickly, not because the system was perfect, but because the evidence was undeniable. Thompson and Rogers were officially terminated. Their body cam footage leaked to the public. Civil rights leaders demanded further accountability. Community members came forward, each with their own story of humiliation, fear, profiling, or violence. Their testimonies painted a picture much larger than Marcus's case. It was never just about him. It was about everyone who had suffered quietly, believing no one would listen. Marcus read some of their statements in the following weeks. One from a young black student harassed on his way home from a football game. One from an elderly man who had been handcuffed because his car looked too new. One from a mother who said her son still had nightmares every time he saw blue and red flashing lights. Their pain mingled with Marcus's own, forming something powerful. A collective truth. A truth the world could no longer pretend didn't exist. Meanwhile, changes began taking shape. Chief Monroe, after many tense meetings and public apologies, announced sweeping reforms. New hiring standards, mandatory body cam transparency, intensive anti-bias training programs, a civilian oversight board, whistleblower protections for officers who reported misconduct. The department that once ignored countless warning signs now stood under a microscope, because for once the world was watching and the world was demanding better. Reform didn't erase what had happened. It didn't undo the pain. It didn't restore lost years to those whose records were stained by unjust arrests. But it was a beginning. And sometimes, beginnings matter most. Marcus tried to stay out of the spotlight, but his story spread regardless. The Pentagon released a statement praising his composure. National commentators debated systemic racism in policing. His email was filled with messages, from soldiers he'd trained, from parents thanking him for speaking the truth, from strangers who saw themselves in him. He read some, ignored many. But one message, from a boy no older than 16, stayed with him. I'm scared every time I see police lights, but hearing your story made me feel like maybe things can change. Marcus stared at that sentence for nearly an hour. Change, hope, possibility. The very things he wasn't sure he believed in anymore. But someone did. A boy he'd never met. A boy whose life could be different because of what happened. Marcus folded the letter and held it gently in his hand, like something fragile, something alive. Maybe change begins like this, he thought, with honesty, with accountability, with someone speaking the truth at the right moment in time. One evening, as the last of the day's light slipped beneath the horizon, Marcus sat on his back porch with a cup of strong coffee. The sky had turned violet, stars beginning to pierce through. He closed his eyes. He could still feel the cold of the asphalt under his knee. He could still hear Rogers's mocking laughter. He could still feel Thompson's gun pressing into his ribs. He could still taste the metallic bitterness of fear. Fear swallowed so deeply it became discipline, not panic. But he also remembered the moment he stood again, the moment the truth shifted the night, the moment accountability finally arrived. He had survived because he had rank. He had survived because he had connections. He had survived because he was a colonel. But what about the countless others who weren't? What about those who were silenced, lost, forgotten? The question burned inside him, searing, unyielding. Marcus lifted his head slowly, the evening breeze brushing across his face. He whispered into the quiet, I survived for a reason, not for ego, not for glory, not for revenge, but for purpose, for change, for truth, for the next boy terrified at a traffic stop, for the next father praying he makes it home to his kids, for the next woman gripping her steering wheel as blue lights flash behind her, for them, for America, for the country he fought for overseas and now found himself fighting for at home. Weeks later, Marcus returned once more to the road where everything happened. This time, he didn't kneel in pain. He stood tall, shoulders back, eyes forward. A soft breeze moved through the pines, the shadows long and gentle. The road glimmered faintly under the fading sun, as if acknowledging him. He said nothing at first. He simply let the quiet hold him. The kind of quiet that no longer felt threatening. The kind of quiet he had earned. He placed a hand over his heart, not out of patriotism, but out of something deeper. A promise to himself. A promise to the people who had been unheard for too long. A promise to the next generation that justice is not a dream but a duty. And then he whispered words meant not for the trees or the road, but for the soul of a nation still learning how to be better. We must treat each other like human beings, not suspects, not enemies, not stereotypes. Human beings. His voice trembled, not with sadness, but with truth. We can't build a stronger America if we tear each other down. We can't build unity if we choose hatred. We can't build safety if we abuse power. And we cannot move forward if racism continues to define our present. The wind brushed against him, almost like an acknowledgement. We must choose kindness, he whispered. We must choose justice. We must choose love. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply. And in that moment, he felt it. A release, a shift, a softening, a beginning. Not healing, not forgiveness, not closure, but a beginning. The first step toward the America he believed could exist. The America he fought for. The America he still hoped for, even now. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the trees, Marcus walked back to his SUV. He opened the door, paused, and looked over his shoulder one final time at the place where humiliation nearly consumed him, but where truth ultimately prevailed. He wasn't grateful for the pain. He wasn't thankful for the trauma. But he was proud of what the truth had accomplished, not for him, but for the community, for the future, for the hope the world now held on to a little more tightly. As he drove away, the night no longer felt heavy. It felt open. Possibility stretched before him like a long, winding road. And Marcus Walker, soldier, survivor, leader, and human being, knew exactly what message he would share with anyone willing to listen. We rise by lifting one another. We heal by seeing one another. We build a stronger America by loving one another. The road behind him was no longer a place of fear. It was a place of transformation. And the road ahead, a path toward unity, justice, and hope. And in the end, this story wasn't just about one man kneeling on asphalt in the dark. It wasn't just about two officers abusing their power. It wasn't even just about one phone call that changed everything. This story is about America, about who we are, who we have been, and who we still have the power to become. Because when Marcus stood back up, when he refused to be broken, when he demanded dignity not only for himself, but for every life demeaned and dismissed, he reminded us of a truth we cannot ignore. No badge, no title, no uniform gives anyone the right to strip another human being of their humanity, and no man or woman's worth should ever depend on rank, status, wealth, or skin color. We rise as a nation only when we rise together. We heal only when we choose empathy over ego, justice over silence, love over hate. Every time someone speaks out, every time someone refuses to look away, every time someone stands up to say, "This is wrong," America becomes just a little stronger. Because the strength of this nation doesn't live in the hands of those who wield power. It lives in the hearts of those who choose compassion. So let this story stay with you. Let it challenge you. Let it open your eyes, soften your heart, and deepen your commitment to treat every person with dignity and respect. And if you believe in a kinder America, an America where we protect one another, uplift one another, and love one another as neighbors, as family, as human beings, then join us. Hit subscribe to the Racist Reality Channel. Explore the truth. Stand with us. Learn with us. Grow with us. And when you finish this video, visit the channel and watch more stories. Stories that expose injustice. Stories that inspire change. Stories that remind us of who we are meant to be. Because together, we can build a more loving, more united, and truly stronger America. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And thank you for choosing compassion.